The movie told you she was the wild one, the mother who broke every rule polite society had written, rode motorcycles, lived inside a biker world most people only ever see from the outside, and somehow, against every medical timeline any doctor had ever set, raised a son who outlived his diagnosis by nearly a full decade. What the movie never told you was that Rusty Dennis, the woman Cher portrayed in Leather and Defiance, sat down before her death and said things about her son, about that film, and about the night he died that the studio never particularly wanted you to hear. This is the story of Roy Lee Dennis and his mother Florence, and the space that always existed between the Hollywood version and what actually happened inside that family. Roy Lee Dennis came into the world on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California, and from the very start, his body had other plans for him. As a toddler, he picked up ear and sinus infections with a regularity that worried his parents, but didn't alarm anyone into serious action, until a routine tonsillectomy at age 2 sent a radiologist to the phone in a hurry. Something on that X-ray didn't belong, and what followed was nearly a full year of visits to UCLA Medical Center, sometimes multiple times within a single week, before a diagnosis finally arrived: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a condition so rare that in 1965, when Rusty first heard those words spoken aloud, only 6 other documented cases existed anywhere in the history of medicine. 6 cases in the entire world. The disease causes abnormal calcium deposits to accumulate inside the skull, thickening the bone, pushing it outward, distorting the face, and compressing the brain in a process that destroys vision, then hearing, then neurological function, slowly and without mercy. Doctors delivered the prognosis without softening a single word. Rocky would almost certainly go blind, would likely lose intellectual function, and would probably die before reaching 7 years old. Dead before his 7th birthday. That was the medical consensus, and it landed in front of a Brooklyn-raised woman who had spent her teenage years riding with motorcycle gangs and dancing at Coney Island. A woman who responded to institutional authority roughly the way she responded to most authority, which was to decide she'd see about that herself. Florence Rusty Tullis was born May 29, 1936, in Brooklyn. Daughter of a truck driver, Jewish and sharp in ways that came from birth and circumstance in equal measure. She was 13 when junior high expelled her for chronic truancy, 14 when marijuana and motorcycle culture became daily fixtures, 15 when she dropped out entirely and took work as a dancer at Coney Island. Every bit of this before she had reached the legal age for a driving learner's permit. At 17, she married a truck driver named Tommy Mason, and a son named Joshua followed not long after. That marriage came apart. She returned to her parents, met Roy Dennis, moved west to California, and Rocky arrived in 1961. By the time the diagnosis came down, Rusty had already organized her entire personal philosophy around one conviction: that any person capable of making themselves sick held the equal ability to make themselves well. She applied that belief to Rocky from infancy, without flexibility or exception. When pain arrived, she sent him to his room and told him to push through it. Whether that was genuine empowerment or something harder to name is a question only the people inside that house could honestly answer. But what isn't in question is that Rocky's refusal to see himself as dying reflected something that philosophy planted in him early and tended every day. The biker community surrounding Rocky was not backdrop or decoration. The Turks were Rusty's people, and they treated Rocky as one of their own from when he was small, building around him a circle of rough, loyal, unconditional care that showed up without announcement and stayed without conditions. The character Gar in the film, played by Sam Elliott, was drawn from a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's actual partner, and every person in that biker circle was as real as the loyalty they showed. As for Rusty's drug use, a subject the movie handled with a certain dramatic framing she later rejected specifically and publicly, she was direct about it in ways that cut through the softened version. She didn't reach for substances because she was overwhelmed or drowning or struggling to cope. She said she partied all the time and that drugs were simply part of that lifestyle. That distinction mattered to her enormously, and whenever reporters tried to apply the more sympathetic reframing, she pushed back, because she understood clearly the difference between a story about a mother in crisis and the actual truth of who she was and how she lived. Rocky's record inside the school system did more work than any biographical account could replicate. He entered academically behind and graduated Sandberg Junior High as an honor student, a trajectory that reversed every assumption his early teachers had made about what was possible for him. Classmates elected him best buddy, most good-natured, and friendliest camper, categories invisible to any medical chart but precisely descriptive of what the people around him actually experienced day to day. He tutored classmates who struggled, set his rate at $3 an hour, and negotiated that figure himself with the calm confidence of someone who understood his own value. He memorized the night sky with the dedication of someone who intended to stay under it for a while. At summer camp, he fell for a girl who was blind, a girl who couldn't see his face and saw everything that mattered anyway. And that relationship said more about who he was than any diagnosis ever managed to. When surgeons offered to surgically alter his features, he answered with a question. Who would he see in the mirror if they changed his face? He kept it. Every doctor who had scheduled his death before he could read was still seeing patients when Rocky Dennis celebrated his 16th birthday. Mask arrived in theaters in 1985, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, with Cher playing Rusty and Eric Stoltz as Rocky, and it earned more than $48 million during its theatrical run. Rusty received $15,000 for the film rights. Sit with that ratio for a moment. And the bulk of that sum went immediately toward medical expenses for Joshua, who had been diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma as the AIDS crisis reached its most devastating peak. She didn't sell Rocky's story for personal gain. She sold it to try to keep her other son alive, and that attempt failed completely. Joshua died in 1987 at 32 years old. When reporters came looking for gratitude, for tears, for some gracious and camera-ready appreciation of what Hollywood had done for her family, Rusty called the film a fairy tale. Not a tribute, not a memorial. A fairy tale, spoken plainly, without anger but also without the warmth the studio might have preferred to hear from her. On Cher specifically, Rusty was generous in a way that came across as entirely genuine. She told the Chicago Tribune in 1986 that Cher had depicted her very well, and then added, almost as an aside, that she had always thought of herself as perfectly normal and assumed it was the rest of the world that had something wrong with it. That line is probably the most accurate self-portrait she ever offered in a single sentence. What actually stayed with her were two specific places where reality and screen diverged sharply. The film compressed more than a decade of lived experience into what plays on screen as roughly a single year, and Joshua, her firstborn son, the one she would lose to AIDS 2 years after the film opened, appears nowhere in the movie. He was written out entirely, and that omission reportedly sat with her in a way that nothing else about the film's choices did. The music dispute tells its own separate story about how this family's history got handled. Rocky Dennis had a devoted relationship with Bruce Springsteen's music, the kind where the songs stop being songs and become part of a person's sense of self. Bogdanovich built the entire original soundtrack around that catalog. Universal Pictures then failed to reach a licensing agreement with Columbia Records and quietly replaced every Springsteen track with Bob Seger songs, telling neither the director nor the Dennis family that the substitution had occurred. Rusty appeared on a San Francisco talk show in 1985 and said, in flat and measured terms, that she didn't think Rocky had even known who Bob Seger was. Bogdanovich sued Universal for $19 million, arguing the swap violated his contractual right to final cut. The Springsteen tracks were eventually restored for a director's cut DVD released in 2004, 2 full decades after the film first reached audiences. By September 1978, Rocky was 16, wheelchair-bound in his final weeks, and losing ground to the disease that had spent 9 years losing the argument with him. On the evening of October 3rd, the family gathered at a restaurant for dinner, and everyone seated at that table could see how drastically things had changed. Rocky came home carrying a headache. Rusty did exactly what she had done throughout his entire life, sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died at home that morning, in his sleep, at 16 years old, having outlived every medical projection by nearly a full decade. The film depicts Rusty discovering his body, a scene constructed to carry the full emotional weight of that moment. In reality, she was at her lawyer's office, managing a drug possession charge when Bernie called to tell her. That gap between screen and fact isn't an indictment of Rusty Dennis. It is a clear demonstration of how much Hollywood needed her story to hold a shape it never actually had. After Rocky's death, Rusty relocated to San Francisco, adopted Buddhism, and spent her time counseling people working through drug addiction. A turn that was somehow both unexpected and perfectly consistent with who she had always been. She had plans at the time of the film's release to work with the Shanti Project, which served terminally ill patients, many of them navigating AIDS during the worst years of that crisis. She continued riding motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, the right tire detached from her three-wheel bike at speed, sending her into a curb and then into a telephone pole. No one knew for days. Friends and family only tracked her down after a brief item in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune mentioned an unidentified 70-year-old woman badly injured in a motorcycle crash, and someone made the connection. Both legs were broken, and her lung had been punctured, but she survived the impact, because she was Rusty Dennis, and that was what she did. The infection that followed, though, was the one thing she couldn't push through. Florence Rusty Tullis died November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. A Chicago Tribune profile from 1986 described her as a 49-year-old Jewish mother, former drug addict, go-go dancer, and Shackley products distributor, living in a tidy biker apartment in San Francisco's Mission District with one nephew and three men named Pelican, Lenny, and Steve. That portrait is accurate in every single detail, and still doesn't come close to containing her. She never asked why. Not for Rocky, not for Joshua, not for what happened to her in 2006. She said Rocky's death was just another place to go, and he had always loved going places. She and Joshua, she said, simply did not believe in dying. The screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan, who first met Rocky and Rusty at UCLA's Center for Genetic Research and felt the force of both of them immediately, put it in the simplest possible terms. Rusty wasn't the PTA Mother of the Year, but she was the exact mother Rocky needed. Rocky Dennis died at home, without machines, without a hospital corridor, without anything his mother had promised wouldn't be there. She had made him that promise, and she kept it the same way she kept everything, on her own terms, without softening the edges, and without caring in the least what anyone else thought she should be.